Administering Citrix Metaframe XP. Citrix Metaframe XP is managed by the Citrix Management Console, or the CMC. Now, when we first installed Citrix Metaframe, the CMC was also installed to enable us to manage Citrix from our Citrix Metaframe server. Now, if you want to be able to manage Citrix from a different machine, perhaps it's your local Windows XP workstation, then you'll have to install the CMC manually. So to install the CMC, simply drop your Citrix Metaframe CD in your drive. When the splash screen appears, come over here and click on Other Tools and Components, then Administrative Tools, and then click on Management Console. Then just follow the simple wizard and away you go. Now you can manage your Citrix Metaframe farm from your workstation. Now there are a few system requirements to be aware of though. You must have the Java runtime version 1.3 or higher, at least 64 megs of RAM on top of your system RAM, 25 megs of disk space, and you must be running Windows NT 2000 or XP. Now those requirements are pretty low, and I'd be surprised if you can't easily exceed them, so you shouldn't have any problems. Now we can launch the Citrix Management Console in two ways. First, we could either click on Start, All Programs, Citrix, and then come down here and choose Management Console. Or alternatively, on our Citrix server we have the Metaframe XP bar, and of course we can come over here and click the bottom button, which just launches the Citrix Management Console. Now you'll note that because we enabled pass-through authentication, we're getting straight into our Citrix Management Console, and of course we do not have to log in. So there's the example of pass-through authentication that we talked about earlier. Now the CMC looks remarkably like a Microsoft Management Console, except that it does run under Java. Now the reason it's Java based and not MMC based is that the same console can then run under a Unix or Linux operating system. So like an MMC, we have a left-hand pane and a right-hand pane. Now down the left-hand pane, you have quite a few options depending on what version of Citrix Metaframe XP that you have installed. The first thing we can see up the top here is the name of the farm that we configured when we installed our first server. Now if we right click on our farm, we've got three options. First of all, we can refresh the farm in the console, we can update file types from the registry, and would use this option to map file types to publish applications in our Citrix farm, and of course we can see the farm properties. Now within the farm properties we've got quite a few options. First of all, connection limits lets us specify how many connections a user can have to the servers in our farm. Now there is no default limit, but if you do check this box, you can enforce a maximum number of connections. Now this doesn't apply to administrators, but if we check the maximum connections per user, we can also then check to enforce a limit on administrators as well. Finally, we can also log to the Windows event log any denied logins that result from having exceeded the maximum number of connections. The ICA Keep Alive option, which is currently disabled, allows you to manage the state of an ICA connection by sending packets to a device to see if the connection still exists. Now the default timeout value is 60 seconds. Now this just means that if an ICA client doesn't respond within 60 seconds, it will appear as disconnected. When the ICA connection is re-established, the users will then have to reconnect, and then they can resume where they left off. Now next we have the ICA settings. Now we have two categories of options here, the ICA display and then the auto client reconnect options. At the top here we've got two boxes that are checked, discard redundant graphic operations and alternative caching method. Now Metaframe XP uses the newer algorithms to handle the graphics transfer between the server and the client. If you are using older Metaframe 1.8 servers in your environment, then use this alternative caching method as well. If you aren't using old Metaframe servers, then you might want to unselect this box. Now next we have the maximum amount of memory we wish to allocate to graphics to each user's session. The default is 5,625 kilobytes, but you can certainly change this if you wish. Now once this memory limit for graphics is reached, then the next two settings here will come into effect, which are designed to keep the performance of the connection running at full speed. The default is to degrade the resolution to the client, or if you prefer, you could change this to degrade the color depth first. Now by default here, the user will be notified when the memory limit is reached, and then these changes are enforced, so they're not just sitting there wondering what on earth just happened to their connection. Now under the client auto reconnect, when a client connection is disconnected, it will attempt to reconnect automatically. You can set whether the reconnection attempt requires user authentication, in other words, does the user physically need to log in again, and of course, whether you will log these reconnection attempts in the Windows event log. Now the information option just simply tells us some information about our farm, such as how many client sessions in use across our farm, the licenses that we have in use, the number of applications that have been published, and so on. Interoperability allows us to specify whether we have any Metaframe 1.8 servers in our farm. Next we have Metaframe XP settings, and here we can set what the response will be when an ICA client broadcasts, and we'll talk more about the items in this settings window here in another video. So we'll move on. The next one here is SNMP, or the Simple Network Management Protocol. This allows us to use SNMP traps when certain events occur, such as session log-on or log-offs, disconnects, and threshold exceeded. Now if you do enable SMP agent on all servers, you will get a message reminding you that this will apply to all the servers in your farm. Now as a side note, on the auto run splash screen when you put your Metaframe XP CD in your drive, under other tools and components, and then Network Manager plugins, you'll see that we actually have some plugins for Tivoli NetView, HP OpenView, and then of course Unicenter. So if you are using these particular enterprise network management tools in your environment, then you can use them to manage your Citrix traps. So I'll just close this and we'll close this. Now finally down here you can also see we can send traps based on a certain percentages of licenses used. Now the next thing we have here is the speed screen browser acceleration. Now this allows us to specify whether Macromedia Flash is allowed to run in browsers running in a Citrix session. Now the default is enabled and to allow Flash, but you can deny the ability to use Flash by clicking on this button. Now Zones identifies the Metaframe servers that exist on separate subnets in our network. Now here you can see currently that we have one zone of 192.168.0.0. Now by expanding this you can see here that we have one single server. So if we were to add a new server on this subnet, we'd see it listed here. But if we were to add a new server on a different subnet, such as a 10.0.0.0 subnet, then we'd have a new zone for that server as it would exist on a separate network segment. Now it's important to understand that one server in a zone acts as a data collector, and this server will communicate with other zones' data collectors to exchange information about their zones. The data collector is chosen by election, but you can override this manually if you have a specific server that you want to be the data collector for the zone. Now you'll notice here that we have a blue tick next to our server 01. If we highlight this server here and then click on Set Preference, we could modify this server so that it never becomes the data collector by selecting its preference to Not Preferred. So here in a multiple server zone environment, we could influence which servers become data collectors. Now one thing to keep in mind as we work within the Citrix Management Console is that with the exception of the licenses and user information, everything else in the Citrix Management Console is set to automatically refresh when there's been any changes. Now if you do want to enable automatic refresh for licenses, simply click on Licenses and then select View, Preferences, and then check the Automatically Refresh Licensing data box. Now if you do want to enable auto refresh for users, click on User Data, and then you can select one or more of these boxes and you can auto refresh user data for server, server folders, or applications. Okay, the next thing we have here in our CMC is applications. Now this is where we can publish our applications for users to run. Now we'll skip this for the moment as we have an entire video dedicated to publishing applications. Now the Installation Manager gives you the ability to install and publish your applications on your Metaframe XPE servers. Now think of this as group policy software deployment for your Metaframe XPE servers. You'll only need to assign the software package once and it will be downloaded and installed on each of your Metaframe XPE servers for your users to use. Now we'll cover this in detail in a later video. Now the next thing we have is licenses, and we've already covered that. Then comes load evaluators, and here we can configure a variety of settings that dictate which Metaframe XP server a client will connect to when it needs access to a published application. The ICA client will contact the server farm to locate a server that hosts a public application that it wants to use. The load manager will then select the server from its list of servers that has the lowest load and then returns the address to the ICA client so that it can connect. Metaframe XP administrators, well here you can add or remove users that have administrative privilege in the Metaframe farm. Now currently, as you can see, we only have the one account so far. But we can right click here and add a new Metaframe XP administrator if we like. And of course, if we highlight our existing administrator, we could right click and delete or disable his account as well. Now, disabling the account can be useful if, say, this administrator is going on leave for a while and you don't want to remove their account, but you also don't want their account to be compromised either. Now, if we select properties, we can be very selective about the items that this administrator can see in their CMC. Now, by default, the administrator account can see everything. But of course, if we come over here and uncheck any of these boxes, then this administrator won't be able to use these features. So this is very useful if you have certain administrators that only perform certain tasks. So for example, you might have an administrator that only publishes applications. So then you might only select that option for them. Okay, the next thing we have here is policies. And here we can set Metaframe XP settings that apply to groups of users or just specific users. Or we can also apply settings for the entire farm as well. Now next we have printer management. And as obvious as this sounds, here we can manage printers and drivers. Next comes the resource manager, and this allows us to monitor real-time processes, status information and applications on our Metaframe servers. And finally, we have the servers option, which allows us to configure specific server settings and information. At the top of this tree, we took a look at farm-specific information. Here, we become more granular and we can configure options relating to individual servers. Okay, so we've taken a bird's eye view of the Citrix Management Console. In the next videos, we're going to take a look at configuring these options in a lot more detail.